Since the dawn of civilization, the greatest mystery faced by humanity has not been found in the skies or in the depths of the earth, but in the final moment of life. What happens after death? This question, simple and inevitable, has always carried both terror and fascination. Kings and slaves, warriors and priests, all bent before the same enigma. And from that enigma emerged some of the most disturbing beliefs in history. In many cultures, death was not seen as an end, but as a passage. Yet that passage was rarely serene. It was surrounded by dangers, judgments, and horrors that made life itself a preparation for facing the unknown. For many peoples, dying meant walking through invisible corridors, confronting entities that tested the courage of the soul, and submitting to forces that decided eternal destiny. Among the Egyptians, death was a trial. The soul stood before Osiris and his judges to have its heart weighed against the feather of the goddess Mawat. If the heart was pure, the dead could enter the paradise of the fields of reeds, an idealized version of earthly life. But if found impure, the punishment was the most feared of all: being devoured by Emmet, the Soul Eater, and ceasing to exist forever. It was not just the fear of suffering, but the fear of annihilation. To be erased from eternity was a fate worse than pain. In ancient Greece, the soul was believed to cross the river Styx to reach the underworld ruled by Hades. But this crossing was not free. Charon, the ferryman, demanded a coin. Those not buried with the offering would wander forever as restless shades, unable to rest. The Greek afterlife was not only a place of torment, but of forgetfulness. Death could mean endless silence and emptiness. A destiny as terrifying as eternal fire. In Mesopotamia, the vision was darker still. The land of the dead was described as a realm of dust and shadows, where souls ate clay and wandered without purpose. There was no reward, no justice, only eternal decay. For the Mesopotamians, death offered no comfort, only the endless repetition of suffering. It was a grim worldview, reflecting deep pessimism. The afterlife was not salvation, but exile. These beliefs shaped entire societies. If the afterlife was threatening, then life had to be lived in constant preparation for it. Laws, customs, and religious rituals were oriented by the fear of what awaited beyond the final breath. Burial rites were meticulous, for any failure might condemn a soul to eternal wandering. 2. Rest in peace was not guaranteed. It had to be earned. What makes these beliefs truly disturbing is not only their descriptions of torment, but their inescapability. No one could avoid judgment. Kings who ruled with iron fists, warriors who won battles, priests who dictated morality, all were subject to the same relentless forces of the beyond. Power, wealth, and glory meant nothing in the face of the invisible tribunal awaiting every human being. The afterlife became a mirror of human fear. Each culture projected its values and terrors onto the unknown. Where justice was uncertain, myths of harsh judgment arose. Where hunger devoured the living, visions of dust and decay appeared. Where power was absolute, myths were born of rulers who continued to reign even beyond death. In every version, the truth was the same. No one crossed the final threshold unscathed. And perhaps this is the most disturbing detail. Death, in its simplicity, is already inevitable. But ancient civilizations turned it into something even greater. An endless ordeal filled with obstacles, torments, and trials that would make even the bravest tremble. It was not enough to live. One had to constantly prepare to face the unknown, because failure meant not just losing life, but losing eternity. Thus, the fear of death became a tool of power. Priests, kings, and rulers manipulated these beliefs to control their people. Those who obeyed the laws of the temple could hope for a better fate after death. Those who defied the order risked eternal damnation. Religion, power, and the afterlife became inseparable, turning invisible fear into a weapon as effective as swords and armies. The portal of death was not only a biological limit, it was a stage, an invisible arena where every soul was forced to fight. And even those who had prepared most diligently could never be certain they would prevail in that final battle. Ultimately, what makes these beliefs so unsettling is not just what they describe, but what they reveal. Humanity's inability to accept the silence of the end. To avoid the idea of nothingness, mankind invented scenarios even more terrifying than death itself. Judgments, tortures, exiles, and infinite horrors, all to fill the void with meaning. And paradoxically, in trying to tame the fear of death, humanity only made it more terrifying. For the ancients, death was not the end of suffering. In many civilizations, the moment of dying was only the beginning of a trial. A trial harsher, more unforgiving, and more terrifying than anything one could experience in life. If the living world was governed by kings, priests, and laws, then the world beyond was ruled by forces whose judgments were absolute, whose punishments were eternal, and whose verdicts could never be overturned. And the greatest terror was not the uncertainty of death itself, but the certainty that after death, the soul would stand trial. The Egyptians envisioned a courtroom beyond the grave. The dead entered the Hall of Two Truths, where the god Osiris presided, flanked by 42 divine judges. At the center stood the scales, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Mawat, the symbol of truth and cosmic order. It was not enough to have been powerful, wealthy, or noble. The weight of one's deeds determined fate. A heart too heavy with lies, cruelty, or sin tipped the balance, condemning the soul. The punishment was final. Amit, the devourer, would consume the heart, erasing the soul from existence forever. This annihilation was feared more than torture. To cease existing, to lose eternity itself, was the Egyptians' vision of ultimate horror. In Zoroastrian tradition, judgment took a different but equally harrowing form. The soul of the dead approached the Chinvat Bridge, a narrow crossing between the world of the living and the realm beyond. For the righteous, the bridge widened, allowing safe passage into a paradise of light. For the wicked, the bridge narrowed to the width of a razor blade, and the soul slipped into the abyss, plunging into the flames of eternal punishment. Here, fire was not simply destruction but purification. A torment meant to scourge away sin, though at unimaginable cost. The condemned were not merely punished. They were trapped in a cosmic order where their suffering served as fuel for divine balance. In Christianity, the imagery of judgment became even more vivid. The book of Revelation spoke of the great white throne, before which the dead were summoned to be judged according to their deeds. Those whose names were not found in the book of life were cast into the lake of fire, where torment was eternal and unending. Here, punishment was not annihilation but everlasting consciousness of suffering, a hell of fire, brimstone, and despair without reprieve. For centuries, preachers painted these scenes in terrifying detail, not merely as spiritual warnings but as tools of control. To disobey was to risk not just temporal punishment but eternal agony. The idea of an endless hell became one of the most powerful forces in shaping human behavior, as people lived their entire lives in fear of what awaited beyond the grave. The Greeks too imagined judgment, though that afterlife was less a paradise or hell dichotomy than a spectrum of fates. At death, the soul descended to the underworld, where three judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Io. For the just, there was the Elysian Fields, a land of eternal peace. For the ordinary, there was the Asphodel Meadows, a gray and joyless eternity. But for the truly wicked, there was Tartarus, a pit so deep it rivaled the abyss itself. Here, punishment was endless and often symbolic. Sisyphus, condemned to push a boulder uphill for eternity, and Tantalus, cursed with eternal hunger and thirst, embodied the belief that one's crimes would be mirrored in their suffering. Judgment did not just punish. It made the soul's own sins into instruments of torment. The notion of eternal condemnation carried with it a unique psychological terror. In life, pain has limits. Wounds heal, hunger subsides, even torture eventually ends in death. But after death, the punishments described by these beliefs had no escape, no end, no release. To the human mind, this eternity of suffering was almost incomprehensible, and that incomprehensibility made it all the more terrifying. How does one imagine a fire that never consumes, or chains that never break, or hunger that never fades? These visions haunted civilizations, shaping behavior through fear stronger than any army or law. The most disturbing element of these judgments was their inevitability. Unlike human courts, divine courts could not be bribed, deceived, or escaped. A king who ruled with iron cruelty was as vulnerable as a beggar. Wealth, power, armies. None of it mattered in the hall of judgment. Even those who had evaded justice in life would be stripped bare before eternal judges. Death, then, was the great equalizer, and judgment after death was the great reckoning. Some societies sought ways to escape or mitigate these fates. Elaborate burial rituals were designed not merely to honor the dead, but to prepare them for judgment. Egyptians buried the Book of the Dead with the deceased, filled with spells and instructions to navigate the perils of the underworld and appeal to divine judges. Greeks placed coins in the mouths of their dead to pay Charon for safe passage, ensuring the soul would not wander. Christians emphasized confession and repentance, believing that sin admitted and absolved in life would not weigh down the soul in death. Yet even these precautions carried no certainty. The terror lay in knowing that one's fate rested not in one's hands, but in forces beyond comprehension. Over time, these visions of judgment became deeply political. Priests and rulers invoked them to maintain power. The promise of paradise or the threat of eternal fire ensured obedience, not just in public behavior but in the private corners of thought. People did not merely obey laws for fear of prison or punishment on earth. They obeyed for fear of what awaited after their final breath. The courtroom of eternity became the most powerful form of social control, invisible yet inescapable. And yet, despite the fear they inspired, these beliefs also reflected humanity's search for meaning. To imagine a judgment beyond death was to believe that life mattered, that deeds carried weight beyond the grave. Injustice in the world could be explained by justice in the next. Cruelty unpunished in life would face retribution in death. The terror of eternal condemnation was balanced, in some ways, by the hope of eternal reward. But that balance never erased the fear. What makes these beliefs most disturbing is not merely their imagery of fire, chains, and endless torment. It is the universality of the fear they represent. Across cultures, across centuries, humanity imagined that death was not a release but a trial that could damn the soul forever. To live was to prepare for judgment, and to die was to face it. And in the end, no one could escape. The soul's journey did not end in silence. It ended in a courtroom of gods and demons, with verdicts that determined eternity. Some were granted peace, others were swallowed by fire, dust, and despair. And for the billions who lived under these beliefs, death was not just a passage, but a sentence. One that no one could appeal, and that no one could ever escape. In the ancient imagination, death itself was never the greatest punishment. Far more terrifying was what came after. A system of cosmic retribution, where the soul was made to suffer in ways that went beyond the limits of human endurance. Cultures across the world envisioned punishments that made simple death seem merciful. These were torments designed not to end, but to remind the condemned that their sins had marked them forever. They were punishments worse than death itself. For the Greeks, Tartarus was the deepest abyss, a pit reserved for the most unforgivable souls. Here, the condemned were trapped in torments that mirrored their crimes in life. Sisyphus, who defied the gods, was condemned to roll a massive boulder uphill, only to see it roll back every time he neared the summit. His punishment was not pain of the flesh, but futility without end. The crushing despair of labor with no purpose repeated for eternity. Tantalus, who betrayed divine trust, was cursed with eternal hunger and thirst, standing in a pool of water that receded. When he bent to drink, beneath fruit that withdrew when he reached to eat, his torment was the hunger of desire forever denied. These myths revealed a terrifying truth. Punishment after death was not random cruelty, but poetic justice, turning the sinner's own actions into instruments of eternal suffering. The Christians, inheriting imagery of fire and torment, shaped it into perhaps the most vivid vision of eternal punishment. Hell is a realm of fire that never burned out. Unlike Tartarus, where punishment reflected crime, hell was all-consuming, swallowing the condemned in flames, chains, and gnashing of teeth. Here, every sin weighed upon the soul like a stone, dragging it down into the lake of fire described in the book of Revelation. The terror was not only the heat of flames, but their eternity. Pain in life ends. Pain in hell never does. A soul cast into eternal fire would never cease to feel, never cease to suffer, never cease to exist. It was immortality, but twisted into horror. The Buddhists envisioned another terrifying realm, the Nirvana or the hells, where souls burdened by karma endured punishments before rebirth. In the hot hells, sinners were boiled in cauldrons, burned by molten metal, or pierced by fiery weapons. In the cold hells, they froze in endless blizzards, their bodies cracking apart under the cold, only to regenerate and suffer again. Time in these realms could stretch for what seemed like countless ages before the soul was released, though not into peace, but into another cycle of existence. In this vision, suffering was not eternal, but so prolonged, so relentless, that eternity itself seemed to lose meaning. In Hindu traditions, Yama, the god of death, presided over hellish realms where the guilty endured punishments that made earthly pain pale in comparison. Sinners might be dismembered and reassembled, devoured by animals only to be restored for more torment, or flayed endlessly by demonic attacks. Every punishment was designed not to destroy but to perpetuate, ensuring that the weight of sin pressed down again and again without relief. Unlike mortal justice, which ended in execution, divine justice prolonged agony precisely to ensure that no transgression ever went unanswered. The Aztecs envisioned their own terrifying afterlife punishments. For those who did not die honorably in battle or sacrificed, the soul traveled through Mictlan, a 9-level underworld filled with ordeal. Souls faced mountains that crushed them, winds that cut like obsidian, and rivers of blood guarded by monstrous beasts. These trials were not meant as purification, but as punishments that stripped the soul of strengths, layer by layer, until only despair remained. Death, in this sense, was not a release, but a descent into an endless series of degradations. In every culture, what makes these punishments so disturbing is their eternity or near eternity. The body and life could withstand pain for hours, perhaps days, before death intervened. But in the imagination of the ancients, the soul was indestructible, unable to die again, unable to escape. Punishment was therefore infinite. The same torment repeated endlessly, never allowing the condemned the mercy of oblivion. Death was no longer an escape. It was the doorway into a prison with no exit. The weight of sins was measured not just by what one had done, but by the inevitability of judgment. In life, people could lie, deceive, or evade justice. But in death, the soul was stripped bare. There were no excuses, no defenses, no appeals. The sins themselves spoke, and the punishments reflected them. If greed consumed a person in life, hunger consumed them in death. If pride defined them, humiliation without end awaited them. If cruelty marked their reign, torment would mirror it back for eternity. Divine justice, in this vision, was merciless and absolute. These visions of punishment worse than death were not just theological ideas. They shaped entire societies. They influenced laws, rituals, and morality. People behaved not only out of fear of earthly kings, but out of terror for what awaited beyond the grave. The weight of sin was a chain dragging behind every action, a reminder that even the smallest misstep could echo for eternity. The fear of punishment after death was perhaps the most powerful force of control, stronger than any prison or sword. And yet, there was a deeper layer of horror in these beliefs. They revealed that humanity's greatest fear was not pain, but futility. To suffer endlessly, without hope, without end, without meaning. That was worse than the grave. The ancients understood this, and their myths reflected it. The worst punishments were not those that killed the body, but those that denied closure, denying the possibility of escape, eternal hunger, eternal labor, eternal fire. These were the nightmares that haunted the living. The irony of these beliefs is that they offered both terror and a twisted form of justice. For those who had suffered under tyrants, the thought that cruelty would be punished eternally gave comfort. For those who feared their own sins, the same thought gave despair. Either way, the weight of sin hung over humanity like a shadow that could not be outrun. In the end, what these punishments revealed was humanity's struggle with mortality and morality. Death could not be stopped, but what came after was imagined as a reckoning so severe that life itself bent under its shadow. To sin was to carry a burden into eternity, and to die was not to escape, but to pay. Thus, death was not the end. It was the opening of an account, the weighing of deeds, and the execution of sentences designed to last forever. And in that vision, the greatest horror was not in dying, but in living on endlessly, painfully, in a state where suffering itself became eternal. Punishments worse than death were not an escape from mortality. They were its cruelest extension. When most people today think of reincarnation, they imagine a comforting cycle of rebirth. The soul returning in another form, another life, another chance. But for the ancients, reincarnation was not always a gift. In some of the darkest beliefs, rebirth was a curse, a punishment worse than final death. To die was not to find peace, but to be thrown back into existence again and again, often in degrading or horrifying forms. For restless souls, reincarnation was not salvation. It was entrapping! In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, the cycle of samsara, the endless wheel of birth, death, and rebirth, was both a cosmic order and a prison. While enlightenment offered escape, most souls remained trapped, dragged back into existence by the weight of their karma. And karma was merciless. A life of cruelty or selfishness could mean rebirth into a lower form. Not as a human, but as an animal, or worse, into realms of torment where suffering stretched for ages. Death, in these visions, was not an escape from misery, but a doorway to it. The Buddhist Narakas, the Hell Realms, held some of the most terrifying descriptions of reincarnated existence. Souls laden with negative karma could be reborn in realms of unending agony, where they were boiled alive, pierced with weapons, or frozen into shards of ice, only to regenerate and suffer again. After countless lifetimes of this torment, they might rise again into the human world, carrying the invisible scars of suffering, only to risk falling once more. The cycle had no mercy. To fail in life was to risk lifetimes of pain before even the possibility of liberation. The Hindus, too, described horrifying those who sinned might be reincarnated as animals fit for slaughter, as insects crushed underfoot, or as beings condemned to lives of misery and degradation. Rebirth was not always forward. It could be downward, a fall from humanity into the lowest forms of existence. A tyrant who had feasted on the suffering of others might be reborn as prey, hunted and devoured. A miser who hoarded food while others starved might return as a starving beast, condemned to hunger without satisfaction. In this way, reincarnation was not a promise of progress, but a threat. The ultimate reminder that every action echoed beyond death. But it was not only in Asia that terrifying visions of rebirth appeared. Among the Celts, legends spoke of souls returning to wander the world in forms neither human nor animal, trapped between states. In Norse mythology, warriors who failed to prove themselves in battle might be denied entry into Valhalla, and instead return as wretched spirits, endlessly roaming the earth, never finding peace. In these traditions, rebirth was not glorious, but grotesque, a punishment for failing to meet the standards of gods or fate. What makes these beliefs particularly disturbing is their sheer inescapability. Death was not the final act. For the restless soul, there was no release, only another beginning. And that beginning could be worse than what came before. Unlike Hells of Eternal Fire, where Torment at least had a clear setting, reincarnation threatened a soul with endless variety in its suffering. You could return as a beast of burden, living a life of exhaustion and pain. You could return as prey, consumed by predators. You could return again and again, each life no better than the last. Eternity was not flames, but futility. The philosophy behind these beliefs was both profound and terrifying. Every act mattered. Every decision weighed down the soul with karma. And karma did not forget. Even if human justice failed, cosmic justice would find you, dragging your soul back into existence to pay in forms more degrading than any punishment on Earth. Death itself could not erase guilt. It only transformed it into another life. In this way, reincarnation was not a cycle of hope, but a cycle of terror, where the soul was forever chained to its sins. The psychological weight of this belief was immense. To live under the shadow of reincarnation meant knowing that mistakes were not confined to a single lifetime. The cruelty of one life could ripple into the next, ensuring that punishment was never truly over. Even death became meaningless, for it offered no finality. A tyrant might be overthrown and killed, but his cruelty would drag him back. Perhaps as a worm crawling in filth, or as an animal led to slaughter. The punishment was not a single judgment day. It was an endless return to misery. And even for the righteous, the cycle was not comforting. Few achieved enlightenment. Few escaped the wheel. Most souls, it was believed, were doomed to wander through countless lifetimes, rising and falling like waves in an ocean without shore. Even a good life could be undone by a single misdeed, condemning the soul to fall again. The cycle of samsara was less a promise of renewal than a cosmic trap, and the struggle to escape it defined entire religions and cultures. Among some traditions, there were even darker twists. Certain legends claim that the truly restless or cursed souls might reincarnate into forms that were neither human nor beasts, but monstrous. Hybrids, demons, or beings consumed by endless hunger. These were not merely punishments, but warnings. A soul that lived in corruption could become corruption itself, returning to haunt the world it once defiled. In this way, reincarnation blurred the line between the afterlife and the living world, filling both with terror. What makes these beliefs chilling is the sense that there is no end, no escape, no silence. In other visions of the afterlife, judgment ends in a final sentence: eternal torment, annihilation, or paradise. But in the cycle of reincarnation, there is only repetition. The wheel turns endlessly, grinding souls beneath it, offering only the faint hope of liberation after lifetimes of suffering. To the restless soul, the afterlife was not a resting place, but a return to a world filled with pain. This vision of punishment through rebirth also carried with it immense social power. Rulers and priests could invoke reincarnation to enforce moral codes. To question authority risked not just earthly punishment, but cosmic demotion, the threat of being reborn into a lower form. Condemned to lives of servitude or degradation. Fear of reincarnation as punishment was a powerful tool, ensuring obedience not only in life but in thought, shaping entire civilizations under the weight of an eternal cycle. In the end, the horrors of reincarnation reveal a deep human anxiety. The fear that death does not release us, but traps us. To cease existing is one kind of terror, but to exist forever in forms that degrade, humiliate, and torment is another. These beliefs show that for many cultures, the afterlife was not about peace, but about accountability. A cosmic system where every act demanded payment, not once, but again and again, through lifetimes without end. Reincarnation, then, was not always a hope for renewal. It was a curse of endless return. To the restless soul, death was only the beginning of another descent, another punishment, another life worse than the one before. And in that cycle, eternity itself became the greatest torment. For many cultures, the most terrifying aspect of death was not what lay beyond the grave, but the possibility that the dead might return. Ghosts, curses, and restless spirits were among the most enduring and unsettling beliefs about the afterlife. They represented the idea that death was not final, that the boundary between the living and the dead was fragile, and that when it broke, horror followed. For the ancients, the dead were not silent. They lingered, they haunted, and they punished. In Mesopotamia, one of the oldest cradles of civilization, ghosts were seen as dangerous beings. The dead who were not properly buried or honored were believed to rise again as Adamu, restless spirits condemned to wander. These spirits did not return to bring comfort but to torment. They spread disease, nightmares, and madness among the living. Priests developed elaborate rituals to keep them at bay, using offerings, incantations, and exorcisms. But the fear remained. A neglected dead person could bring ruin to entire households. Death was not the end of a relationship! It was an ongoing threat. The Greeks feared similar unrest. Those who died violently, without burial, or without justice, were doomed to become ataphioi. Spirits trapped in torment, they haunted battlefields, crossroads, and abandoned places, howling in rage. These ghosts were not only terrifying but contagious. Their presence poisoned the land, bringing famine or misfortune. To appease them, the Greeks left offerings at graves and shrines, but appeasement was not always enough. In tragedies, the return of the dead was a recurring theme, reminding audiences that the past could never truly be buried. In ancient Rome, the belief in malevolent spirits was so strong that entire festivals were dedicated to warding them off. During the Lemuria, families performed midnight rituals, offering beans to ghosts to drive them away. Fathers of households would walk barefoot through their homes, spitting out beans while chanting exorcisms. The fear was not irrational. Romans believed that an unsatisfied ghost could attack the living, strangle them in their sleep, or curse their descendants. For a society obsessed with legacy and ancestry, the thought that one's forefathers could return as enemies was a nightmare beyond comprehension. The Chinese also held deep fears of restless dead. Spirits who were not properly honored during ancestor rituals were thought to become hungry ghosts, cursed to roam the world with insatiable appetites. These beings were depicted with swollen bellies and tiny mouths, forever starving yet unable to eat. Their hunger drove them to harass the living, bringing misfortune until they were appeased with offerings of food and incense. The Hungry Ghost Festival, still observed today, is a remnant of this ancient terror. A time when the veil between worlds thins and the restless return to feed. But beyond haunting, curses were perhaps even more feared. Across cultures, the dead were believed to wield the power to strike back from beyond. Tombs were inscribed with warnings. Those who desecrated graves or stole from the dead would be cursed. In Egypt, some tombs carried chilling threats, promising that intruders would be devoured by crocodiles or tormented in eternity. These curses were not merely symbolic. They reflected the belief that the dead themselves could enforce them. And when misfortune struck those who violated burial sites, the living took it as proof that the curse was real. The idea of curses was tied to the belief that death did not strip power away. Instead, it amplified it. A king in life could command armies, but as a spirit, he could unleash plagues. A priest could shape rituals in life, but as a ghost, he could twist them into horrors. Death was not an equalizer. It was an escalation. And for the living, this meant that every grave carried the potential of danger. Every burial site, a reminder that peace was fragile. The most disturbing aspect of these beliefs was the intimacy of the threat. Unlike distant hells or cosmic judgments, ghosts and curses invaded the world of the living. They crept into bedrooms, poisoned food, whispered in dreams, and spread illness. The dead were not far away. They were here, watching, waiting, punishing. Death did not remove them from life. It made them a constant presence. This fear shaped cultures profoundly. Burial rituals were designed not only to honor but to restrain the dead. Offerings, prayers, and sacrifices were less about devotion than about protection. Entire festivals revolved around feeding, appeasing, or driving away spirits. Families lived with the weight of knowing that failure to honor their dead could bring destruction upon them. The afterlife was not distant. It was woven into everyday existence, lurking just beyond the threshold of sight. And yet, ghosts also revealed something deeper. The guilt of the living. Many ghost stories involved those who had been wronged, murdered, betrayed, or abandoned. Their return was less about supernatural malice than about justice denied. The living feared ghosts because they feared the past. Every haunting was a reminder that wrongs could not be buried, that sins committed against others would not vanish with their deaths. Ghosts were not just terrifying figures, they were accusations, embodiments of guilt that could not be silenced. Even in modern times, echoes of these ancient fears remain. Tales of haunted houses, cursed objects, and restless spirits still captivate and terrify. The imagery may have changed, but the core belief remains the same. Death is not silent. and the dead do not always leave us in peace. The weight of history presses down, reminding us that those who are gone may still reach for us with unseen hands. The universality of ghost beliefs across cultures suggests a truth about humanity's deepest fears. While the promise of paradise or the threat of hell lay in distant realms, ghosts were immediate. They blurred the line between this world and the next, between the living and the dead. And because of that, they remain some of the most disturbing beliefs about life after death. To the ancients, death was not final. It was a transition, but one fraught with peril. The dead could rise again, not as protectors, but as tormentors. Their curses could outlast generations. Their presence poisoned the air of the living. And for those who lived under the shadow of these beliefs, the most terrifying thought was not that they would die, but that their dead would never leave them in peace. The greatest fear of all ancient peoples was not merely death itself, but the possibility that death was not the end. For countless civilizations, the final breath was not silence, but the opening of a darker chapter. An eternity shaped by belief, ritual, and dread. And at the heart of these visions lay one haunting truth. Humanity has always been obsessed with escaping oblivion, even if the escape led to something far more terrifying than nothingness. The obsession with eternity was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offered hope. The promise that the soul could endure beyond the fragile span of earthly years. On the other, it carried the weight of fear. That what endured might not be peace, but torment. 2. Imagine eternity was to magnify both dreams and nightmares. And for most, the nightmares won. Among the Egyptians, eternity was carefully engineered. Elaborate tombs, pyramids, and burial rites were not simply about honoring the dead. They were acts of desperation against oblivion. The pharaohs filled their tombs with treasures, food, and spells, convinced that eternity could be controlled by wealth and ritual. Yet, their very precautions revealed the fear beneath. Without these protections, the eternal journey would collapse into chaos. Eternity was not a gift. It was a threat to be tamed. The Greeks wrestled with the same paradox. To them, eternity was not glorious unless one achieved the rare honor of reaching the Elysian fields. For the majority, eternity meant wandering as a shadow, stripped of memory, identity, and joy. Immortality in this vision was not triumph, but diminishment. To exist forever as less than oneself was a punishment more dreadful than death. In Greek tragedy, the afterlife was often invoked as a reminder that even the greatest heroes could not escape this fate. The eternal reward was rare. The eternal grayness was common. Christianity offered perhaps the most vivid expression of this obsession. Eternal life became the cornerstone of faith. Paradise for the faithful, eternal fire for the damned. Both visions magnified eternity into absolutes, endless bliss or endless torment. In sermons and texts, eternity was not an abstract idea, but a visceral reality, pressed into the minds of the living through imagery of flames, angels, torment, and glory. Here, eternity was the battlefield on which every life was judged. To live well was not merely to be good, but to secure a place in infinity. To sin was to risk endless pain. In Hinduism and Buddhism, eternity took another form. The endless cycle of samsara. Here, eternity was not static, but repetitive. An endless wheel turning through birth, death, and rebirth. Liberation from this cycle was the ultimate goal, but for most souls, the wheel was relentless. Lives piled upon lives, sins upon sins, the weight of karma dragging the soul again and again into new forms of suffering. Eternity, in this sense, was not a reward, but a prison. Only enlightenment offered escape, and enlightenment was rare. What unites all these visions is their unsettling symmetry. Eternity was never neutral. It was either paradise or horror, liberation or imprisonment, light or fire. Humanity, it seems, could not imagine an eternal silence, a peaceful nothingness. To confront mortality, people chose to create eternities filled with meaning and with terror. In doing so, they transformed death into something larger than life itself. The obsession with eternity also revealed the mechanisms of power. Priests, rulers, and emperors invoked it to control populations. Fear of eternal torment compelled obedience more effectively than armies or prisons. Hope of eternal reward inspired sacrifice, loyalty, and devotion. Entire civilizations were shaped not by the realities of this world, but by the imagined weight of the next. Eternity was a leash, invisible but unbreakable, binding humanity through both fear and longing. But perhaps the darkest element of this obsession was its futility. No matter how carefully tombs were built, how faithfully rituals were observed, how fervently prayers were spoken, eternity remained unknowable. The pharaohs who filled their pyramids with treasures could not take them beyond the grave. The priests who promised paradise could not prove its existence. The monks who sought enlightenment could not guarantee us. Eternity remained a mirror, reflecting back humanity's deepest hopes and darkest fears, but never offering certainty. The psychological burden of these beliefs was immense. To live under the shadow of eternity was to live in constant awareness that every action echoed beyond death. Every lie, every cruelty, every act of greed was not confined to a single lifetime, but weighed upon the soul forever. People were haunted not only by ghosts of the dead, but by the ghosts of their own deeds, knowing that they might follow them into eternity. Life was no longer about survival. It was about preparing for an infinite existence after the final breath. And so, death itself was robbed of finality. The final breath was never the end, but the beginning of judgment, rebirth, or haunting. This transformed the human relationship with mortality. Death was no longer something to accept, but something to fear, avoid, manipulate, or outwit. Entire cultures bent under the weight of this obsession, building religions, rituals, and societies around the question of what came after. Yet, the irony is stark. In seeking eternity, humanity created hells, curses, punishments, and endless cycles of despair. In trying to avoid nothingness, people invented horrors that were worse than death. The fear of silence gave birth to visions of eternal fire. The refusal to accept finality created the nightmare of endless return. The rejection of mortality built prisons that extended beyond the grave. The conclusion is as chilling as it is inevitable. The obsession with eternity reveals more about the living than the dead. It exposes the terror of non-existence, the guilt of injustice, and the hunger for meaning. But in trying to answer the unanswerable, humanity filled the void not with peace, but with horror. The final breath, then, was never truly final. For the ancients, it was the doorway to eternity. An eternity that promised either divine reward or unbearable torment. And in that vision lies the darkest truth. Eternity was never a gift. It was a sentence! The most disturbing beliefs about life after death remind us that what people feared most was not dying, but living forever in pain, futility, or emptiness. The afterlife was imagined not as an escape, but as a magnification of everything feared in life. And for those who carried these beliefs, every breath taken in this world echoed in the eternity that awaited beyond it. Thus, the dark obsession with eternity defined entire civilizations. It shaped laws, rituals, and empires. It bound people through fear and longing, and it whispered through every culture the same haunting truth. Death may end life, but belief ensures it never ends. Fear. From the moment humanity first buried its dead, we have struggled with a single haunting question. What comes after the final breath? Civilizations across millennia, from the banks of the Nile to the temples of India, from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the cathedrals of medieval Europe, have wrestled with this riddle, and though their answers differed, a disturbing truth united them all. The afterlife was rarely imagined as peace. Instead, it was judgment, torment, hunger, fire, or endless return. For the ancients, death was not release. It was the beginning of something far more terrifying. The Egyptians feared the devourer who erased the unworthy from existence. The Greeks shuddered at the thought of wandering forever as a shade or suffering in Tartarus, where sins became eternal punishments. The Mesopotamians dreaded the bleak underworld of dust and decay, where souls ate clay in a land without light. Christians lived under the shadow of hellfire, the lake of flames, where pain had no end. Hindus and Buddhists spoke of the wheel of samsara, where karma chained the soul to lifetimes of degradation, suffering again and again with no certainty of release. And in every corner of the ancient world, ghosts, curses, and restless spirits ensured that even the grave could not protect the living from the dead. What ties these visions together is the refusal to accept death as silence. For ancient peoples, non-existence was too unbearable, too empty, too meaningless, so they filled the void with something worse. They imagined eternities of torment, realms of judgment, punishments that mirrored sins, or cycles that trapped the soul forever. The fear of nothing gave birth to horrors greater than nothing. And in doing so, humanity revealed its deepest terror. Not mortality, but immortality. The obsession with eternity shaped entire societies. Kings built tombs that rivaled mountains, desperate to control their fate beyond death. Priests wielded power by declaring themselves interpreters of the afterlife, dictating rituals to appease gods and spirits. Laws were infused with the language of eternity, threatening sinners with punishments not only in this world but in the next. And ordinary people lived their lives in constant awareness that every action might echo into eternity. Death did not free them. It bound them more tightly than life ever could. But beneath the fear lay something else. A search for meaning. To believe in judgment was to believe that life mattered, that cruelty would not go unpunished, that suffering would not be forgotten. For those oppressed by tyrants, the idea of eternal justice brought a dark comfort. If not in this life, then in the next. For those who suffered hunger and despair, the promise of paradise. Whether the fields of reeds, Elysium, or heaven, offered hope beyond the grave. Eternity was not only terror, it was also a weapon of hope. And yet, it was a hope shadowed by dread. For the line between reward and punishment was razor thin, and no one could ever be certain which awaited them. The darkest irony of all these beliefs is that, in trying to tame the fear of death, humanity only amplified it. Instead of silence, we imagined screams. Instead of nothing, we imagined chains. Instead of peace, we imagined eternity itself twisted into punishment. We built hells hotter than any fire, prisons deeper than any earth, and cycles longer than time itself. And by doing so, we turned the final breath into a moment not of rest, but of terror. Think of the weight of this on the human mind. Every culture, every civilization burdened its people with the same haunting thought. Your death is not yours alone. It is a trial, a journey, a torment, a cycle. Your deeds will follow you, your sins will chase you, and your soul will never escape. No king, no beggar, no warrior, no priest could hide from it. Death was the great equalizer, and eternity was the great reckoning. Yet perhaps the most unsettling truth is not what the ancients believed, but what those beliefs reveal about us. Humanity cannot bear the thought of insignificance. The idea that life could end, that existence could vanish into silence, is unbearable. So we chose to invent eternity. And in our desperation to make life matter, we created afterlives filled with nightmares. Our fear of nothingness burst something worse than nothing. Even today, these shadows linger. Ghost stories still haunt our nights. Sermons still thunder about eternal fire. Philosophy still debates the wheel of rebirth. The modern world prides itself on science and reason, but deep down, the same ancient questions remain unanswered, and the same fears still stalk us. We are still haunted by the thought that death may not be the end, and by the possibility that what lies beyond is not peace, but horror. And so we return to the final breath. That moment, fragile and inevitable, has always been the doorway to our deepest anxieties. For some, it is the threshold of judgment, where every deed is exposed. For others, it is the entry into cycles of endless return. For still others, it is the breach through which ghosts and curses slip back into the world of the living. But in every case, the final breath is never truly final. It is the beginning of eternity. The most disturbing beliefs about life after death are not just relics of ancient civilizations. They are mirrors. They reflect our refusal to accept mortality, our desperation to find meaning, our terror of vanishing into silence. And they whisper the same chilling reminder: eternity is not always salvation. Sometimes, it is the cruelest punishment of all. So as we look back on these visions, the ghosts that never leave, the cycles that never end, the fires that never burn out, one truth remains. Humanity's greatest fear was never death. It was what came after. And perhaps, even now, that fear is what keeps us awake at night, staring into the darkness, wondering if the silence beyond the final breath is truly silence at all. History hides its darkest truths in plain sight. If you want to uncover the next forbidden secret, hit like and subscribe right now.